Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining the STRIDE webinar series today. My name is Turochy at Auburn University, and along with Virginia Sisiopiku at the University of Alabama at Birmingham, we will be your presenters today. So thank you all for joining us. And we will be presenting on a research project that we worked at our two universities, and we'll introduce that in a moment. Before we get there, just a couple of housekeeping items to mention. If you have any questions for me or Virginia along the way, I'll be speaking for a few minutes, and then Virginia will be speaking with us for a few minutes after that. If you have any questions along the way, you can go ahead and type them in the chat function in Zoom. Move your mouse down to the bottom of the screen or the top of the screen or wherever your Zoom toolbar is parked to have that pop up. And then feel free to drop in questions, and we'll try to address those after we finish speaking today. This first slide you see is just the general STRIDE cover slide. STRIDE is a 9-university consortium based at the University of Florida, and we are the Regional University Transportation Center, or UTC, for Federal Region 4. So that's just a note about STRIDE and about how we'll operate today. I'll speak with y'all for a few minutes, and then Virginia will do the same to describe the portion of the research that was done at UAB. So this webinar is to present the work that we did at our two universities for what was called STRIDE Project P2. The title of the overall research project was Development of Guidance for the Scheduling of Freeway Work Zones to Minimize Congestion Impacts. So a little bit of background before we get into the research work and the findings that hopefully will be useful for transportation agencies. Background, why is having information to make decisions on how to manage traffic in work zones important? Well, there's many reasons. And for example, an estimated about 1/4 of all non-recurring traffic congestion is associated with work zones. So that's a lot of traveler delay and lost time due to that traffic congestion. From a safety perspective, it's worth noting that over the last few years, we've averaged around 800 traffic fatalities in work zones annually. So that's on a typical day, a couple of traffic fatalities in work zones. So it's important from that perspective as well. To make informed decisions on how to schedule freeway work zones, and specifically, we're going to be talking about lane closures. We're concerned about when traffic demand would exceed the capacity of the work zone and that lane closure. Because when that happens, queues form and you get traffic backups. And when that happens, we have the risk of those secondary or end of queue crashes, which tend to be pretty severe. The classic situation there is where there's a backup and very slow or stopped traffic that's trying to get through the work zone and through a lane closure, and some driver for some reason may not be paying attention and runs into that queue at relatively high speed. So we're interested in providing information to DOTs to help them schedule when to allow the lane closure to occur, as best as possible to minimize the mobility and the safety impacts. So the portion of the research work that was done at Auburn, I've entitled Capacity of Freeway Lane Closures, looking at breakdown probability and heavy truck impacts. And I need to acknowledge a couple of graduate students, Nick Jean and Han Lo, who also worked on this research project. And I've been interested in work zone traffic management pretty much as long as I can remember, going back almost 30 years ago to when I was an engineer trainee and then a traffic engineer with the Virginia DOT, and work zone safety was my area. So this is an area that's been of importance to me for a long time. So the purpose and scope of the portion of the research project that was conducted at Auburn, again, trying to support an informed approach to scheduling lane closures on freeways. We looked at the capacity of lane closure in a freeway work zone. And we treated capacity as dynamic rather than a single static deterministic value. And that's an important premise guiding the work, because while we have tools that exist, for example, in the highway capacity manual that allow estimation of the capacity of a work zone, it's still a single deterministic value rather than having some sort of range or variance or spread that accounts for the actual randomness in traffic conditions. So in this research, we tried to account for that. So we were interested in estimating the probability or the percent chance that a breakdown in traffic flow and therefore a backup or queuing and all the mobility and safety impacts of that will occur. And this approach that we'll discuss in the next few minutes allows transportation agencies to take a risk-based approach to the scheduling of freeway lane closures. In other words, what's the tolerance of risk that a backup will occur at a lane closure? So we'll get into that over the next few minutes. So the objectives of the portion of the research work that were done at Auburn was to further develop some traffic simulation models for a classic 2-lane to 1-lane freeway lane closure on one side of a 4-lane freeway or interstate highway across a range of traffic conditions. So it was built on the traffic simulation models in the package VISIM that were developed and calibrated for a previous STRIDE research project entitled Project J, that this project that we're going to discuss in the next few minutes expands on. So we'll quickly go through the findings of that project and then get on to the new findings that we have to report today. If you would like more detail on that STRIDE Project J, just Google STRIDE Project J and the project page will come up along with links to the final report and to the recorded webinar. So in this research, we built upon sort of a pilot approach or test case that was the conclusion of that previous STRIDE project. Expanding the range of traffic conditions in terms of volumes, truck percentages, and so forth, addressing the previous work. And again, we'll look into that over the next few minutes. And culminate in the development of a prototype decision support tool that transportation agency decision makers can use to make a more informed decision as to when to allow a lane closure to occur. And along the way, because we were looking at capacity in a live traffic stream with field data that had a fair amount of heavy trucks in it, we were also able to develop some passenger car equivalencies for those heavy trucks and compare those with what's in the highway capacity manual. So first, let's spend a moment taking a look at the site where we collected the field data. This is a section of I-59 and I-20 overlap just southwest of Tuscaloosa, Alabama, where the data were collected for that previous STRIDE project where the models were developed and calibrated and then expanded in the current work. So it was a classic 2-to-1 lane closure on a rural freeway, 4 lanes, 2 lanes in each direction in level terrain. And that's important to note because the findings that we'll get into in a few minutes ago carry that caveat with it, is that it was for a rural freeway 2-to-1 lane closure in level terrain. So for 2 weeks, that work zone was in place, several days with a left lane closure, and then several days with a right lane closure at that same location. So details on the screening or the quality control of the field collected traffic data and the development of the VISIM traffic simulation model, and then the subsequent calibration and validation processes for that model can all be found in the STRIDE Project J report and webinar. So we'll just hit the highlights here. One of the interesting things we find is we started looking at conditions where traffic demand was such that we were reaching capacity for that lane closure. We had to define at what point in traffic conditions did we consider there to be a breakdown. A criterion had to be decided upon. So we used the criterion in the 6th edition of the Highway Capacity Manual that states when average speeds remain more than 25% under free flow speed for at least a 15-minute period, then that can become a rule by which we can declare that a breakdown has occurred. And we have a table here at the bottom of the slide. I realize the numbers are small, but the point is for left lane closures and right lane closures, and with traffic data binned in 15-minute intervals and 5-minute intervals, and looking at the pre-breakdown flow rate imminently before queuing occurred, as well as breakdown flow rates, and then Q discharge rates. That's what QDR stands for. We had the data in the field from this rural freeway lane closure and level terrain to come up with all these values, and those were the basis for the Visten model. So we'll get more into that here in a moment. Some of the findings from that previous project, just to hit highlights of that for those of us in the audience that do some traffic simulation modeling of work zones, we did have to change several parameters from the default values that were in Visten. For example, Visten uses 8 feet per second squared as the heavy truck acceleration, but that's more appropriate for trucks in Europe, which is where PTV Group, the makers of Visten, are based. So we had to calibrate that to 2 feet per second squared for the larger, heavier trucks that we have in the US. We also needed to modify the default time gap or time headway distribution that's in Visten, and modify the lane changing distance, and found that traffic at our site here in rural southeastern US merges into the lane that's about to be closed further in advance of the actual taper for the closure than the default values in Visten. Again, details on all of that work can be found in the Stride Project J webpage and resources. Okay, so moving on to the work that was done as part of this current project, it's worth noting as background that the models for freeway lane closures did take a major step forward in the 6th edition of the Highway Capacity Manual that was released in 2016. They're more sophisticated and based on much deeper data sets than prior editions of the HCM, yet they're still deterministic. And for a given set of traffic and geometric conditions, the equations spit out a single value for capacity for that given situation. Yet in recent years, some research has suggested that capacity is not actually a fixed value, but has a bit of a spread or a range to it. There's a bit of randomness in there that we wanted to account for. So therefore, we reviewed it as a stochastic process rather than a deterministic process. The methodology that we used in this research was based on some work that was done several years ago by Dr. Eleftheriou at the University of Florida, looking at freeway bottleneck situations, and particularly for ramp metering conditions, and applied that to the work zone lane closure. So for example, here's a test case for these probability distribution curves that we are getting ready to develop. This is specifically based on the field data for our traffic at our study site when there were 10% heavy trucks in the traffic and with a left lane closure. So we can see here that the curve on the right, where along the x-axis we have the traffic volume, and that's in raw vehicles per hour per lane rather than converting to passenger car equivalents. That'll be addressed later. That the traffic volumes only got high enough to run the risk of about a 11 or 12% risk of breakdown. In other words, the volumes at that site were such that most of the time there was no queuing. So this was what we had with the field data, and we had to develop an approach that would increase traffic volumes beyond what existed at the site. So that's done with simulation modeling to further flesh out this curve to extend it to increasing probabilities that a breakdown will occur. And that's, of course, what we are trying to avoid because of the mobility and safety impacts thereof. So what we did is based on the data we had in the field, and then adding some simulation models for a bunch of different conditions with higher traffic than we had in the field, we decided to model traffic flow rates, and that's on the leftmost column in this figure, in raw vehicles per hour across a range of truck percentages, and the cells that are indicated in orange are the conditions we represented. In other words, the reason that it's not a full matrix of conditions that were modeled is because, for example, for low traffic volumes with relatively low heavy truck traffic or percentages, which would be on the upper left portion of this table, those conditions are such that the demand would pretty much never exceed the capacity of that freeway lane closure. Therefore, it was not necessary to model those. And then in the lower right corner, where our traffic volumes are getting higher and our heavy truck percentages are getting even higher, those cells that are below the orange in that lower right portion are those that pretty much will always precipitate a breakdown because demand is going to exceed capacity. So therefore, it's that middle band in orange that were the conditions that we modeled as part of this work. So going back to that test case that we looked at a moment ago, which is shown in the light green on this figure, we looked at a variety of distribution functions to expand that curve, which is shown in the dashed blue line, through to 100% chance that a breakdown will occur. And that was done by looking at different distributions and which model fit the best. It turns out a Weibull distribution, statistically speaking, had the best fit. So with successive modeling, that gave us the best fit for a nice smooth curve that dashed blue line represents. And again, this figure is specific to the case of a left lane closure with 10% heavy trucks in the traffic. So the way a figure like this can be used is for a given traffic volume in raw vehicles per hour along the x-axis. If that information is known and we'd like to take a look at what's the percent chance that a breakdown would occur, for that volume and 10% of that volume being heavy trucks, we find that value on the x-axis and then draw a line up to strike that dashed blue curve, and that will tell us what's the estimated probability that queuing would actually occur. So a ownership agency such as a state DOT, if they are willing to take a risk-based approach and decide on a certain percentage chance of queue occurrence that they are willing to accept, maybe it's 5%, 10%, 20%, that's an agency decision, then they can use this curve and the ones we're going to look at in the next couple of slides to estimate what the maximum volume that would be allowed for that particular percentage chance of breakdown occurring. So going back to, let's go back to this table. Now we're getting ready to flesh out for all the cells in orange, the combinations of traffic volume and vehicles per hour and these sort of intermediate points of truck percentages. Now we're getting ready to add the curves for all of those cells shown in orange after simulation runs, I believe 10 runs per each scenario to get a decent random number of seeds in the modeling. We can look at those breakdown curves. So here are the curves. This is based on traffic data being binned in a 5-minute interval. So we can see here that we have essentially 5 pairs of curves, and those 5 pairs of curves from left to right are for 40% of the traffic being heavy trucks, and then 30%, 20%, 10%, and 5%. And each pair is left lane closure versus right lane closure. So for example, the solid blue curve here represents a traffic stream that's 20% heavy trucks and the left lane being closed. In other words, everyone has to merge right because the right lane is the one that remains open in the 2-to-1 lane closure. So for example, if the traffic volume is, let's say, about 1,100 vehicles per hour and 20% of it is trucks, and the agency is interested in closing the left lane, at that combination of conditions, we can follow that line up to the solid blue curve that represents left lane closure for 20% trucks and find that it's about a 25% risk of a queue occurring, which is obviously the undesirable condition. Now, here are the curves if the traffic data available are only binned in 15-minute intervals rather than 5-minute intervals. With traffic data being binned in or aggregated into 15-minute intervals, it tends to be a little smoother and there's not as pronounced of a peak. And that's why the curves shifted to the left. For example, for a volume of 1,000 vehicles per hour and 20% trucks with the left lane closure, the percent probability of a backup occurring moved by about 10% if we were to compare the 5-minute traffic data aggregation interval curve with the same curve and same volume on the x-axis for the 15-minute interval. And all this will be documented in the final report for this research project, which should be completed soon. We also, along the way, were able to calculate passenger car equivalents, and it's specific to the conditions we had. Again, a rural 4-lane freeway, 2-to-1 lane closure in level terrain in the southeastern US. We'll skip all the math behind it, but at the bottom, you can see that the optimum passenger car equivalent value was about 2.49, or we'll round that off to 2.5. And that disagrees a little bit with what's in the Highway Capacity Manual 6th edition. For heavy trucks and level terrain, the recommended equivalency value is 2.0, but yet there is some other research that's been done over the years and a couple other studies that found that for work zones, we can expect that passenger car equivalency value to be a little larger. So wrapping up the portion of the work that was conducted at Auburn here, just summarizing, and then I'll turn it over to Virginia to describe the work that was conducted at UAB. We modeled freeway lane closures stochastically rather than deterministically. And this approach allows transportation agencies to take a risk-based approach to how to determine when to allow lane closures to occur. It's essentially more informed than perhaps an arbitrary time range of 9 p.m. to 5 a.m., for example, to allow lane closure to occur. With some basic traffic data, this approach is a bit more robust. So these prototype curves that we just looked at allow an agency to make those decisions based on traffic volume, percentage of traffic that's heavy trucks, and whether it's a left or right side lane closure. And we also did a little bit of work with passenger car equivalents and found that for rural freeway and level terrain, in a work zone situation, those values are higher than what is indicated for use in the Highway Capacity Manual. So that wraps up the portion of the research work that was conducted at Auburn. So Virginia, go ahead and fill us in on the work that was done at UAB.
Thank you so much, Rod. So let me just take a second here. Rod covered a lot of points in his introduction about the importance of studying work zones. And at UAB, we did a parallel study to look at the impacts on traffic operations from considering various work zone setups, various traffic demand, and various traffic composition options. And this work was done primarily by my student, Tasif Chai, that I would like to acknowledge, and myself. It is important because the traffic work zones are a common phenomenon. So the possibility of a driver to confront an active work zone is 1 out of every 100 miles driven on the highway. So since we have to live with them, I think it is important to understand how we can set them up so that we can minimize the impacts on traffic operations and the inconvenience that motorists experience. So our study at UAB had some similarities, but differences also with the one presented from Rod. We tried to investigate the operational impacts of work zones related to geometrics, and that refers to lane position, length of the work zone, and so on, to traffic control setup, especially focusing on early and late merge, and then changes in traffic demand and traffic composition. So we started this as a classic study where we engaged in a literature review that focused on available temporary traffic control strategies, earlier studies that looked at work zone performance assessment, and also availability of simulation platforms. And we used the input that we got from the literature review to guide the formulation of our study objectives and also the experimental design. So when we looked at the available temporary traffic control strategies, we identified 5 strategies, which are listed here on the slide. And from those, the most commonly used are the early merge control strategy and the late merge control. So these pictures that you see here depict the details. For the early merge control strategy, we set up the signs that advise the drivers that there is a lane closure, and so they have to merge into the open lanes. On the late merge control, then we let the drivers get close to the point where the lane drop is, and then they try to merge into the open lane, as you see at the bottom sketch in the figure. And all the details on how this needs to be set up are provided by the MUTCD. So we reviewed those so that we have a realistic representation on our scenarios. Now, with respect to previous studies, we identified several studies and we summarized those in our final report. Several of these studies also looked at early and late merge, as it was the case in our work. And they used microsimulation modeling. Some had some field results as well that were included there. And we also reviewed available simulation platforms, and we identified 5 that we looked into great detail. And similar as Rod in their part of the study, we selected VSIM for our experiments later on. So all in all, the literature review confirmed that there is a variety of work zone designs and control options. And there are some studies that have tried to quantify such impacts. However, there is still work to be done in order to better understand the impacts of different types of work zone placement, length, traffic control, and traffic composition. With that in mind, then we decided to use Birmingham, Alabama as a case study, and in particular select a portion of I-65 as our test bed. That is a 10-mile-long section of I-65 running through the city of Birmingham. A table that you see here on the screen highlights the geometric characteristics of that static corridor. It includes 20 traffic message channels, and the posted speed limit is 60 on the main line and 45 on the ramps. It has 3 to 4 lanes per direction, and the lane width is 12 feet. And we placed the work zone around the middle of the section on the northbound, and that was on purpose so that we can also have the opportunity to see the impacts as far as over space. So, to see the extent of congestion due to the presence of the work zone upstream from that location. As far as the experimental design is concerned, we decided to vary the work zone length from 1,000 to 3,000 feet. We considered 2 traffic control strategies, the early merge and the late merge. We had a 3-2-2 configuration where 3 lanes, from the 3 lanes we dropped to 2 lanes. That drop could happen either on the left lane or on the rightmost lane. And we had some scenarios that looked at what happens if we drop the middle lane. We had, of course, the base model as well as work zone models. And we developed certain scenarios to study the effect of heavy vehicle increase from 10%, that was the baseline condition, to 15, 20, and 25%. And also we tested the impact of volume increase on traffic operations. So we like to see what happens if we increase by 10%, 20%, 30% our volumes. All in all, we had a total of 27 scenarios. 7 were for the baseline conditions and 20 work zone conditions that we ran. And we ran 3 iterations for each scenario, resulting in 81 runs for the entire analysis. As I briefly mentioned before, we chose the VISIM platform for our simulation. This is a very well-known and well-tested model, so we have confidence in using the model, same as our colleagues at Auburn. But of course, you know, we had to tweak the model because it doesn't have a specific module that simulates work zones. We got traffic volume data from ALDOT, and we chose a specific weekday. However, ALDOT does not continuously collect data for all ramps, obviously, and the main line. So we had to supplement some of this data from another day or two, and then we had to kind of rebalance the traffic. This is just an example of one of the scenarios that we simulated. You can see on the top of the picture, the lane is blocked. It is the rightmost lane that is blocked in red. And then you see the vehicles as they are trying to merge into the open lanes. And also you see the queue formation as a result. One important part of modeling with simulation models is to perform a validation, calibration and validation of the model. And so we did that for our baseline scenario where we gathered some data from the National Performance Management Research data set that is federally available set that was made available to us through our partners at the Regional Planning Commission. And this data provided us actual field data, travel time data, or over a 24-hour period. And we also generated similar travel time data from our baseline scenario. And we show those here on the graph. You will see the field data are shown in orange. The VISIM model output is shown in blue. And the closer those two are, the greater the confidence you can have that you are representing realistically the real conditions. So typically, when these data are within plus or minus 15%, then the validation of the model is successful. And so you see here, the yellow and gray lines show those 15% limits, and we can see that the model was successfully validated, or the baseline VISIM model of the network was successfully validated, and that gave us confidence on the results. So speaking of the results, first we wanted to know if the length of the lane closure has an effect on operations. So here we consider the late merge and the left turn closure. And we can see that these results are pretty close. So as we varied the length of the closure from 1,000 to 2,000 to 3,000 feet, we don't see much of a difference on the delay, which leads us to the conclusion that the work zone length effect is insignificant. And this is what we observed also when we looked at early merge options. So again, we can say that the length of the work zone effect is negligible. Then we considered the differences in the impacts on traffic operations from three different lane closures, the one that is on the far left, on the middle, and on the right lane. And clearly from this graph, you can see the red bars popping up. That shows that the middle lane blockage produces much higher delays than the other two setups. So based on what we observe, we would definitely recommend that this middle lane blockage is to be avoided when practical, and which is often the case. So next, we observe the effect of lane closure placement over space. And so it is similar findings, but here we consider the upstream effects as well. So once again, the red line represents the middle lane block, and the green and black refer to the right or left lane blockage. And so you see where the work zone is shown on the screen. And if you look to the left of the screen, you will see the upstream impacts. And once again, it is clear, especially when you look at the non-peak conditions, that the delays are higher when you have a middle lane closure, but between the left and right, we don't see any major differences. The next experiment that we ran was to increase the traffic volume. So on your screen, you will see the baseline model in blue. And then in green, we have a 10% increase of the volume. And then in yellow and red, the 20% and 30% increase. So what we can see from that scenario is that the corridor can easily absorb 10% increase in the traffic volume. However, when we increase even further at 20% or 30%, the performance is expected to deteriorate drastically. Similar experiments we ran as well, considering the work zone presence and having similar results. We also consider the variation in track percentage in our study, same as similar to what Rod presented, but for our corridor, and the results are shown here on the screen. From the graph, from the top graph, you can see the performance deteriorates significantly with the presence of 20% or 25% tracks in the traffic stream. And in fact, if you look at the bottom graph where we have the late merge left lane blockage, on the right-hand side, you can see that when we have 25% tracks, which is depicted by the red line there, actually the model cannot recover from the congestion even within the 24 hours. So definitely, you know, this is this shows that there is up to a certain limit of of tracks, of percentage tracks that the network can easily accommodate. Well, we got a lot of useful information through the observation of those graphs. We thought that perhaps it is worth to do a little bit of a statistical analysis also to confirm that, to see if those differences that we observed were statistically significant. So we ran simple t-tests and considered the p-values to determine the significance, the significant differences. And those results are summarized in this table that you have on the screen with those that are statistically significant differences highlighted in red. And of course, more details are on our report. So from what we can tell from this statistical analysis, we can conclude that under the early merge, a right lane closure yields statistically significant lower delays during the evening peak. Also, we can see that during peak hours, both morning peak and evening peak, the travel time in the work zones increases significantly when the traffic demand increases from 10 to 20%. The results that we found from this analysis shed some extra light on the types of conditions and options that we can use in order to minimize the impacts, the adverse impacts of work zones on congestion. We hope that these findings can be helpful to transportation agencies that are trying always to develop strategies for lane closures that will have the minimal impacts on traffic operations. But we think that the ultimate beneficiary of work related to work zones is the traveling public, and better set up work zones will definitely have a positive impact on user satisfaction as well as traffic safety. Before I wrap up, I would like to highlight a few of our study assumptions and limitations. So, as I mentioned before, some of the volumes that we used in the modeling were not gathered at the exact same day. Because of the lack of availability of data, but we addressed this through balancing those volumes. Also I mentioned about the validation of the model, but the validation of the model was for the base model, not for the work zone model, since we did not have any actual field data for work zones. And but we recognize that it would be useful to be able to have studies like rods that get real data during work zone operations. And also the great variation along the corridor was not explicitly considered. So in all, we would recommend that future studies also look at weekend operations, because our data were from typical weekdays, and also look at the 3-to-1 lane closures, so closing 2 lanes instead of 1. We have done some preliminary work on that on Project J that Rod also mentioned, but I think that there is still work to be done and things to be learned by looking at different lane closure configurations. This was a case study for that particular corridor along I-65, but our group would recommend that additional corridors are considered so that we can have a more understanding of how this impacts would register as we look at more corridors and as we try to generalize these findings for the benefit of other locations. So with that, I think I will wrap up for now, and I would like to invite your questions and comments for either myself or Rod. So I will not able to see the comments right now, so I would encourage, I'll stop the screen sharing, and I would encourage Rod maybe if he would like to take over from here, either to answer questions or wrap it up.
Sure. And thank you, Virginia, for presenting your part of the project as well. I'm just looking in the chat pod or box now and do not see any questions there, or in the Q&A tool as well. I do not see any at the moment.
I would say that the report will be soon on the website. So I would encourage anybody that has an interest in this work to check it out. And perhaps, if there are questions at that time, both Rod and I will be more than happy to get in touch with anybody that would like more information. Also, we have a couple of publications on this out as well. So we'll be available and happy to respond to you at any time.
And I will say in the chat box, while we were speaking, on Dean Wells with the Stride Center dropped in the link for that page on Stride's website where all those materials for that previous project, Project J, are located. So that's in the chat box right now. Okay, well, if there are no questions, then I guess we'll say we appreciate everybody attending, and feel free to reach out to Virginia or myself if you have questions about either part of the work.
Thank you so much.
Thank you
Have
all.
a great day.